And I would like to introduce and to invite our speakers, Nick Gowing. Let's start with you. Nick Gowing used to work for quite a period of time in BBC World News, and he was a broadcaster for 18 years, and yesterday he was a facilitator of another panel together with Jack Marr. Please applaud to Nick Gowing. Also, Nick highlighted the attacks about the Twin Towers and a lot of interesting news, and the British people came to know a lot of interesting news from him. Then we have Mirani, senior Britain correspondent at The Economist, and he used to work in a very successful edition called Quartz. Sonya Koshkina, my colleague, who has been dealing with journalism for quite a long period of time, and she started doing this at the age of 14, and she's one of the best political reviewers, and her Telegram channel is read by many people. Anna Tkachenko, who is the head of 1+1 Digital and Innovation. And I would like to also invite Katerina Krok, who is a public policy manager for Ukraine at Facebook. And today we're going to talk a lot about cooperation between social media and mass media. I would also like to ask our participants to participate in our discussion panel. And please, the organizers, put the name of the channel on the screen. You may ask questions there in our chat bot. The number of the discussion is here. It is G43444. So we will start with this poll. Where from do you come to know important social and political information now? And you have two options: professional news organizations and social media. I mean, Facebook, Twitter channels, Telegram channels. Why did I ask the question? Because when I was dealing with the study of the topic in the Reuters Institute of Study Journalism, 56% of people gave an answer. And by the way, we already have the first answer, that they come to know about the news from the social media. And I was a little bit frustrated about this as a professional journalist. The paradigm is changing. It has been changing over the last couple of years due to social media. And that's why I'm going to start our discussion with a small provocative question, and I will ask our speakers to briefly answer the following question. What is media now?
Нік, почнемо з вас.
Nick, we will start with you.
Що ви можете назвати медіа сьогодні?
What can you call media?
I think this is a question which is really very important. It's a simple question. What is the media? And I think in the discussion which we're going to have, and discussions I see time and time again, there is a real failure to understand what media really means. Every one of you is a member of the media because of this. I worked for the BBC until 5 years ago. I should really be in Berlin today because I was under the Berlin Wall the night it came down. I remember the darker times of the era in Ukraine, part of the Soviet Union. I was in Poland during Solidarity. I was in Czechoslovakia as one of the very few accredited correspondents. And I say that simply because then the public tended to rely on people like me to produce a version of what was happening. That is no longer the case. And the night the wall came down, for example, 30 years ago, it's scary, 30 years ago today, I still had to feed my material from East German television. There were no satellite links, there was no FaceTime. And if there had been FaceTime and this kind of capability when the wall came down, the whole agenda, the whole horizon of media would have been extraordinary that night, would have been extraordinary, instead of people relying on people like me to tell them what was happening in other parts right around the world. So I urge you in our discussion today to think very broadly, in my view, very strongly, and I was a graduate of the Reuters Institute as well. I wrote a big paper about Sky Full of Lies and Black Swans, where I predicted that those who believed, this was 11 years ago now, I predicted that most people in power and responsibility didn't understand the new information age. The new information age and the new information agenda, and many of them would be caught off. The new vulnerability of power, politics and systems. And as I was explaining to Seville, actually, even the Reuters Institute were not sure they wanted to publish it. Several people said to me, what are you smoking? The idea that people in power are not going to have control over the media. I said, that is the way it's going. And that's really before the digital versions of this came out. You've got to really change your mindset. Everyone is a member of the media in ways which all of you know so well, whether it be in eastern Ukraine, whether it be in Crimea, whether it be what's happening in my country as well, and so many countries. The public has a voice, and the public can actually therefore distort what is happening. Fake news and the label of fake news has really exacerbated this in a terrifying way, but I'm sure you want to talk about it. So I urge you, let's think. Telegram is a member of the media, an important member of the media. It's actually a very important part of the media, but 5 years ago, would we have been talking about Telegram as an important part of the media? It is, and it gives voice to so many people, and that's why we, I have to say, in my big work on thinking the unthinkable now, or thinking the unpalatable, is saying, we're not talking about populism here. In this new media environment, we're talking about pushbackism, because the public and anyone who doesn't like what they see and hear, they can keep pushing back. They can do it through Telegram, they can do it through so many of the social platforms. This is a different kind of media.
Okay, thank you. Leo, what is your answer for this question?
Hello. I'm slightly annoyed Nick got to go first because he said what I wanted to say, but I'm going to say it slightly differently, which is that the media is basically what it's always been. It's a medium through which you communicate information, through which you wield influence and power. A more specific question might be, what is the press? And we'll come to that in a second. But just on the media, to sort of build upon what Nick said, I'd like to point out also that it is true, certainly, that individuals have a certain amount of power, can start things. That tends to be diffuse or hard to corral. Think, however, even more broadly, more than the social networks, more than individuals. One of my favorite examples of this is from around 4 or 5 years ago when Bill de Blasio, who was the mayor of New York, wanted to impose a waiting time on Ubers in Manhattan. And what Uber did, through the app that you would book a taxi, it used the power of the power of having the app on everybody's phones to lobby individuals to say, instead of saying, oh yeah, call a taxi, it'll be here in 2 minutes, it said, 35 minutes. You will have to wait 35 minutes if de Blasio's plan goes through. And that, to me, really communicates the power of these things, of cell phones, as Nick was saying, is that anybody, especially big institutions, especially powerful ones, can wield tremendous amounts of information. But it's not quite as democratic as we all seem to think, I think, because it still needs to be channeled, which brings us to what is the press. And so what is the role of a paid media professional today is a different way of asking the same question. And there, I think the answer remains much the same as it has always been. The role has changed somewhat. So at one point, our job was, and I have to admit, 30 years ago when the Berlin Wall came down, I was in first grade, so I wasn't paying too much attention to how things were going, but I've been doing this for a little while now. But at one point, our job was to seek out information, talk to people to whom otherwise access is unavailable, and bring that to people. Now I think our role has shifted somewhat, but it fundamentally remains the same. Our role now is to take this torrent of information to which all of us have access and make sense of it. To which I'd also add that one important thing remains constant, which is that professional news gatherers continue to have access to individuals that, to powerful individuals, that most people do not. So that's another thing that we can continue to do that is not as easy, or that is a role that has not yet been taken away.
Let's move forward. Sonya, твоя відповідь на запитання, що...
So, Sonya, your answer to the question what media is. I understood that I need to be brief. That's why I try to be really brief. If we think globally, media is something that affects the life of each of us, the development of our worldview, our decision making. Maybe we like it, maybe we don't, but we need to understand that all the people living in the world keep reading some news, but whether the news are read by him in some anonymous Telegram channels or on entertainment channels or on the sites of large internet mass media, that's a different question. I think that we're going to discuss this issue today. Definitely media is changing greatly. But I've already mentioned that Ukrainska Pravda, you mentioned actually that it was founded in 2000, and of course mass media was not in place, social media was not then, and Telegram was not back then. But you know, in spite of the fact that I'm 34 years old, I still remember what printing is. And I think that if we ask students, they will not know this. But I like this dynamics. I like that everything is changing very dynamically in an unpredictable way. That is a drive which moves you further on. And I will not bury traditional journalism, because there is some difference between classical journalists and correspondents and bloggers and influencers and the people, I cannot just pronounce the word, and the influencers, or the people who affect the world. Is that only professional journalist is responsible with his reputation and name for what he does and what he speaks and writes and says to his speakers, because anonymous blog may be closed and a Facebook page may disappear, and that's it. But if you're a journalist, you will have to be responsible, and particularly you have been working for many years for an important and significant mass media. That's just in brief about what mass media is. Anya? Well, everybody is trying to be brief, but that is a very broad question we could talk about for hours, because that is a fundamental issue. I think that media exists for such a period of time as mankind has been in existence, because media stands for history. And history started with some rock pictures, drawings, when we wanted to share some information. And probably now every individual can be a media, but only in case if you can tell stories. And every time you communicate and interact, you understand what the story is about and what kind of story it is. And all the other things are different, because the rules are changing, the forms of telling stories are different, and the expectations are different of the audience as to what the story should be like and where we would like to see those stories, in what format, in what dynamics. The key thing left is history. I'm once again addressing our audience. Please try to be more active in our survey, because we're going to summarize it. And well, the summary is obvious, but still, let's give some chances for traditional media. And please send questions to our chat box to me, because we're going then to voice them and to be looking for the answers. Katarina, your brief answer. What is media? You are the representative of Facebook in Ukraine, so what is media today? Well, thank you for the question. Definitely, it's a pleasure for me to be staying here. And of course, my answer is going to be different than the answer of the previous speakers, because they represent the journalist community, while I represent a company in relation to which we have an ongoing global discussion, which is probably also one of the most important ones for many countries in the sense of professional environment, as to whether Facebook is media. That is an issue we've been addressing in many questions, and we're trying to find an answer to it and to explain this answer to others. And through the prospects of Facebook, we may tell that media is somebody who produces content. That's why we don't consider our platform to be a media platform, because we just provide the platform where people can express their opinions and tell their stories, but we do not generate our own content. But this answer is dramatically different from what we heard earlier, because it's all about how the information is conveyed and not about how it is generated. That's why to be a single giant representative is very difficult, but that is the standpoint of Facebook, because that is an ongoing global discussion which we have not only in Ukraine but generally in the world. Well, thanks to all the participants. So let's summarize. The audience has not been active, unfortunately, in our survey. 37 people only have given answers to questions, and 74% of them have mentioned that they consume socially important information from social media, and 20%, 26% get news from professional news organizations. Well, after that we could close the discussion in a way, but still I would like to show you the next slides. Please, the organizers put the slides on the screen. The slides I've prepared. This is a campaign, a last year campaign of the Colombian School of Journalism, which raised the issues of professionalism and experience of information which is published in social media. And you can see that the person consuming some content, and it's written that these are Facebook posts. Please move on. The next slide. These are retweets from strangers. And the next slide. Well, this is the front page of The Guardian, right, Nick? And it's written that this is a blog of a certain guy. In fact, really, the discussion about what should be done with the quality information which is distributed is very complex, because we've got many channels, and it's very difficult to control the information. And now we've got a lot of people who are discussing the issue of how this could be done, because the whole content we consume is still content, be it Facebook posts, be it Instagram stories, and it's more and more difficult for the person to perceive all this information, and the emotional component gets involved there, what we call post-truth. So I have a different treatment of this notion. I think that post-truth existed always, and this is not a new term. And fake news existed back at the end of the 19th century, and it was launched with this tabloid press. But the question of controlling this fake information is very complicated, because unfortunately now a tweet, a case which is considered in all anti-crisis communications and courses and trains of the company United, was that one of the passengers made a video and made it public, where the passenger was driven away from the flight, from the plane, and within 2 days, the company United, due to some absence of excuses, lost the capitalization of $580 million. And we can also observe how information is used as weapons, how it influences Ukraine, what could be done here, and what the masses could be there in terms of what could be done for the quality of the content information to be controlled. So, Nick, what is your answer to the question?
How we can control the information, and how professional media organization can deal with that media disruption?
Until 5 years ago, I was working for the BBC, and I was working there for 18 years, and before that I was working at ITN in the United Kingdom. For 18 years I was broadcasting around the world, and much of what I was broadcasting was being seen by the people around the world we were reporting about. We had influence. That meant we had to get things correct, and that's the way the BBC still has to operate. But I made the announcement of Princess Diana's death. I knew for an hour that she was dead, but we couldn't report that fact until we were absolutely sure. And one of the reasons I decided to step aside from being a main presenter 5 years ago was the pressure that we found ourselves under in newsrooms from those who were entering the space very quickly with information which it was tempting to broadcast, but we had to verify. And verifying information is critical to all of this. This costs money. It costs money in journalists, it costs money in personnel, it costs money in resources. But the struggle, I think, is really for the veracity and the credibility of brands. And I talk about it as this sky full of lies. There are those out there, and it's much more profound in this area now, this region, whether in Ukraine or in Georgia or in Russia, whether in Eastern Europe as well, with what's happening in Hungary and Poland, where the view of what information is and should be is rather different to the way it should be viewed. I'm saying things that I was reporting at the Reuters Institute, and I was also saying in a lot of warnings to people in government and corporates. You've got to understand the nature of information. This whole thing has now become far more complex because of the Trumpian way of describing it as fake news. Fake news, in other words, if someone doesn't like a fact, they say it's fake, even if it's a fact. This is therefore a big, big struggle now to be sure that what you're reporting is actually correct. And I'm a great consumer of the BBC website because I know it's been verified. But I go back to that evening, 22 years ago, on the death of Diana, where there were none of these in Paris. Photographers were being arrested. But I say to myself chillingly, what if people had been looking at the underpass at the Pont d'Alma and reporting what they were seeing? Let me give you just one example, and I'm using this example because it's embedded in my mind. I was alone in a studio. We had a few people at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and we had a call from someone in Paris who said, we've just seen Princess Diana walk away from the car. We had a real struggle to work, I didn't, but my colleagues had a real struggle to work out, is this correct or not? We had no way of verifying it. We did not report it. But if social media had taken its place then, with people, and there are many people out there who want to fabricate information to their own advantage or just for the fun of it. If we consume that kind of level of information in a newsroom, that's when the credibility of a news organization like the BBC begins to collapse. And I will tell you now, and I haven't said this publicly really at all, I began to feel uneasy that I was sitting there as a main presenter, broadcasting into places like Eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and I use that as just one example, and we had to be sure that our information was correct. But there are those in the propaganda business who were determined to make sure that what came out of my mouth was not the version which was fact, but what they wanted it to be, even if we sourced it. And this is what I would call the real tension now for professional media, for professional journalists, about what is good, verifiable information. What is good, verifiable information as opposed to a polemic or a view?
Я би хотіла запитати.
I would like to ask Anna, you represent traditional media, one of the largest TV channels, one of the largest TV groups in Ukraine, and definitely under the influence of social media, and I'm sure of that, under the influence of global platforms, your business is changing, and you're responsible for digital and innovations direction. So how has this story already changed 1+1 Media Group, and how do we control quality in the background of the problems just voiced by Nick? What is your media group doing specifically to do this, and what can consumers of information be waiting for? And could you comment on this? Well, it's a good question. And keeping on with the previous question, I would like to say that I'm personally convinced that if we're speaking about fake news, it always presupposes personal information of the person who generates this content and who distributes it. And for us, it is absolutely clear that media today is not just a TV box. Media is a story which is spread among different people and in different platforms and in different formats, the way the audience would be willing to see this, since the audience is interested in different formats. And then our stories become vague because of other user-generated stories and content. I really think that the most important thing is brand and trust of the audience in the brand. And we know that even after all the rows with Cambridge Analytica and some critical stories, CNN, Washington Post, and all global international mass media have been faced with an increased number of subscribers, and people have come to understand why they need to pay for media, because this meant that this is really the credible media I can trust, and which is really responsible for the content it generates and broadcasts. That's why I think that on the one hand, not a single media brand now can ignore and avoid social media and video hostings, and we call them frenemies. Why frenemies? Because on the one hand, we cannot avoid them because the main audience, target audience is there. It's about 2 billion or 1 billion users. That is the number of users of these media. But we are using these platforms in order to make the user come to know that we exist. And that is the first step in our long way through which you can come to know about us. But on the other hand, our task is to develop our own platforms, our own window to the audience, where we could fully control the situation and where we could be really sure that nothing will happen to our user data and nobody was going to use this data for any purposes. So in any case, for us, the strategy is that first of all, we need to develop our direct sources in digital for the audience to be able to come there. And this is the field where we are really fully responsible. We undertake some commitments for the content we produce, for the distribution, for the data. Well, Sonya, we have partially been speaking about your Telegram channel, which is sometimes read by even a larger audience than some other sites. Well, I have 40,000 subscribers. Well, this is the audience, which is very, very large. But you are a co-founder, and this is your business, and you are developing a Telegram channel. Don't you believe in traditional journalism since you are developing your YouTube channel? And is it a strategy, or are you doing this just to better work with the audience, or do you see any business potential in this? Well, to tell the truth, if I tell the truth, nobody will believe me, because our colleagues have actually convinced me to start my Telegram channel, and I perceived it as fun, but somehow it really became popular. Livyi Bereh is my life. That is an addition, and this is my business, my strategy, and it's always a priority for me. While the Telegram channel is not an anonymous, it's a name-based one in the information place there quite often. Refers to the publications which you can see in Livyi Bereh, and it is always verified. And as I've already mentioned, with my name and my reputation, I'm responsible for this information which I place on Telegram channel. But there may be some formats which are not always expedient and relevant for traditional media, and I need to collaborate with new media in order to convey this information. And the user has a lot of opportunities for access, more opportunities for access, but on the other hand, the user is sure that the information is verified because it is really checked. But don't you have the feeling that when you publish a certain information in the Telegram channel, you feel less responsible? No, definitely not, because it's not an anonymous page. I really feel responsible for that. And to give a global answer to the question, I would like to say that both Facebook and YouTube and Telegram are supplementary and complementary elements of traditional media, because, well, in fact, online media has become a tradition with us. These are not mutually exclusive things, and if we use, the more intensive these platforms are, the better it is for the user, and the simpler it is. But what do we do with quality? Well, I don't think that these are mutually exclusive things. If you keep working, well, for example, a lot of people are now discussing the phenomenon of anonymous Telegram channels, but I don't know how you can trust a channel if you don't know who is behind it. It's a kind of a mystery riddle for me. And I keep talking about this, and it seems to me that this could be the answer to the question in the future prospect. I'm talking here about the need for having the rules of studying elementary basic information hygiene even in the elementary school. You know, we always wash hands before our lunch because we know this. It's not to be argued about. In the same way, we cannot consume unverified content when well, I think that a lot of us have had stories when a friend of you tells you a piece of news and you ask, where from have you got the news? And they answer, on Facebook. What is the source? Well, Facebook. I read just the title, the headline, or I had a look at a picture, but that was enough for me. I didn't even go to a reference to see who the reference was to and how it was cited. So it doesn't mean that the solution is in media literacy. Well, including media literacy, yes. I think that it's necessary to implement some rules, basic rules, for our personal responsibility for consumption of information. Really, we cannot avoid fakes in general. It's impossible, and we should recognize this. But each of us is personally responsible for the information he or she is consuming and he or she trusts and he or she further operates. If a person refers to some unknown, unclear sources in Facebook where he read just the headline, well, that's a question for me to this person and not to the source of his information.
Put you on the spot here on Facebook. In the United Kingdom at the moment, we have an election. You know what's happening, Brexit, etc., etc. But there's been an incident in the last 2 days where the Conservative Party has put out an advert using false information. Now, the question is whether Telegram, Facebook, and platforms like that are going to be subject to the regulator and the kind of balance and impartiality and accuracy. Now, I'm sorry to put you on the spot here, but Facebook has made it quite clear, and I've just been checking that my memory of what I heard in London is correct. Facebook has said that a doctored video shared by one of the political parties and bought with space, with time on the air, would not have broken its rules on political advertising, and suggested the video had enriched public debate. Now, part of that video was faked. So it really, I have worked for 2 news organizations which are heavily regulated within the United Kingdom by Ofcom, as it's called, the regulator. But there is still this ambiguity and fuzzy middle ground about what the new news platforms, what standards they're going to keep to. So I put that on the agenda. I don't know how this is going to be resolved, but because Facebook have said, actually, we can essentially broadcast something that's incorrect, and we're not going to pull it. That's a serious problem, particularly in the political process.
I would like to join some people in our discussion, to be more specific, the audience, because we have a lot of questions in our chat box, and we will start probably with you. How do we assess economic impact of fake information in the modern world, and is it becoming a new means of competitive fight? I think that the question is to everyone, but we will start with you.
Economic influence of fake information in your reality, and how professional media can deal with that.
The economic consequences.
Economic influence of spreading the fake information.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. What do you mean by the economic influence of spreading fake information?
What is an economic influence of spreading fake news? Is it possible to count that?
Is there a negative commercial impact? In other words, if you make a mistake, does that affect the brand?
Ah, I see. Okay.
That's my interpretation.
Right. Okay, so I guess that's one way of looking at it. Nick's interpretation is there a negative economic impact upon the organization that is spreading fake news, whether by mistake or on purpose? To which the answer would be a resounding no, absolutely not. In fact, it can be quite profitable to spread false information. It's often much more profitable to spread false information than accurate information. I'll give you an example. A colleague of mine actually wrote either an article or a book about this, I can't recall. in which he traced the early history of tabloids in the United States. And so newspapers in the States, and elsewhere I imagine, but let's stick with the States, they literally made stuff up every single day. Well, not every day, because they didn't publish every day, but they made stuff up. You know, little green men found on the moon, that sort of thing, genuinely that sort of thing. There was no way to verify any of this. Nobody had, you know, a means to go to the moon. And these papers sold really well. Economically, it was a fantastic decision. What they realized, however, if I recall correctly, in the face of competition from papers that, a paper that reported accurate information, is if you want, it's great, you can sell lots of papers by making up stuff about little green men on the moon. Once, twice, maybe 3 times. If you want people to keep coming back to you, if you want to build trust in the long term and build a business in the long term, it's actually quite sensible to stick to accurate information. Something similar, I think, is happening online. We seem to forget, all of us, I think, that the era of professional news gathering, of professional news organizations, is a very, very new one. You know, we've had professional journalists who verify information for about 100 years, roughly. I think the BBC was established in the 1930s. The Economist is 175 years old. So I've been reporting a story on teenagers and their news consumption, mostly in the States. And the thing I found was really interesting is that young people who have grown up with online news sources in a way that none of us on this panel have, are far better at being able to tell what is real and what is not. And they're far better at discarding those that they think are full of rubbish and sticking with the ones that they know are accurate.
Соню, напевно, це питання буде влучно поставити тобі.
Sonya, probably the question should be to you. In Finland, the new curricula has the media literacy course. So could our Ukrainian mass media initiate this process, or should we wait for the Minister of Education? That's what I've been thinking for quite a long, and you know that I'm a lecturer at the Institute of Journalism, and I really realized that even at the level of professional education, such things are necessary, let alone about some basic level. That's why if we have this initiative, we, as Livyi Bereh, will definitely support it. I will support it, and probably after this discussion, we will think together whether it should be initiated or no. 2 questions to Hannah. Don't you think that media plays a more important role in the bringing of the society than educational institutions? And how do we stop everything which is done by TSN, our TV channel? And what do you think is the impact of 1+1 on the victory of President Zelensky in Ukraine and the election? Well, you know, the topic of our today's panel is transformation of media in the digital world, and we're not going to talk about politics. That's why I'm not going to answer. Yeah, but I needed to read the question to you. Yeah, I'm responsible for digital and transformation. That's why I don't know what answer I could give to this political question. But the question about education in the state is really important industry. And that is the question about the following. For example, we have a media school which has been in existence for many years, and how did it appear? First of all, we wanted to work with the state, cooperate with the state. We addressed state universities and asked them to do something jointly. But nobody agreed. That's why we got very much angry and we set up our school. And it has led to the situation when, for example, you can become a journalist within 5 months and start being employed, while people in state institutions have to get their education over the period of 5 years, and then we cannot cooperate with them because they are not competent professionals. So first of all, I think that the state needs to take care of media literacy, of media standards, professionalism, because we cannot do it instead of the state. But everything that could be done by us as business on our side, like courses, awareness-raising campaigns, this should be done. For example, I can see the Detector Media is already having some media literacy lectures. We also intend to have the same in our media school. So everything that can be done on our side will be done, but without the state and without the state support and without the whole strategy and ideology that this needs to be changed both in schools and in state institutions, it will not work, I think. Thank you. The question to the request to the organizers is, please put on the screen our second survey. Who's going to win in the fight for the audience trust? And there are two answers, or three answers. These are professional news organizations like TV, social networks, social media, and the third option that they need to get united in this fight. So please vote, and we will summarize a couple of minutes later. So why have we raised this question? Because really the trust and the issue of credibility is one of the important issues in the world. Trust Barometer always has been writing over the last 3 years that the crisis of trust is available in the world, in the institutions, and we have lack of trust in media and professional organizations and even in Facebook. And the question to Facebook, Sonya has mentioned case Cambridge Analytics and a lot of other cases we have had, and quite recently 168 accounts and a couple of pages have been removed from Facebook. So, Katarina, Facebook is the most popular social media in Ukraine. And that raises the question when we had a communication yesterday, I wanted to ask you to explain what the head of the public policy of Facebook in Ukraine is doing, and then I will have a question on you. What could Facebook do with all this media disruption? Well, thank you. First of all, when we are talking about Facebook, it's not just the most popular network, social media in Ukraine, but it's also the most popular platform in the world. Facebook is, it's not just Facebook, it's Instagram, Oculus, WhatsApp, and 2.7 billion people use it per month, which means 1/3 of the planet. This means that quite often for the organization which started as a startup at the level of the university, we are growing globally much quicker as a platform than as an institution. Therefore, there are a lot of regions, there are a lot of countries where we need to pay more attention to, but we don't always manage to do this. And we have got examples of this in Ukraine, because internally for many years we have been implementing a lot of projects dedicated to Ukraine. We've paid more attention to it, but institutionally you cannot create a position inside Facebook overnight and create the whole stuff. And the fact that for Ukraine the public policy manager position has been created. That's very good for Ukraine, because this position presupposes that there is a person who represents Facebook in the country, primarily in the issues vis-a-vis the state authorities and the government, which intends to make some draft laws which could be related to Facebook. And this is the person who actually organizes the work of all the internal teams dealing with projects related to Ukraine. In fact, without information and without approval of this person, no internal decisions are made. And the third important component is launching of global Facebook projects that could function in different regions or in different countries in Ukraine. And for me, this is the main component, because never so much attention had been paid to Ukraine, and therefore we physically didn't have an opportunity to pass certain decisions in relation to Ukraine or to provide Ukrainian users with the products that are available for others. And here is another question which is rather frequently asked, and I often get letters about this. It's content. I'm not the person to deal with content, with blocking, removal of information. This is a different domain. Yeah, but we often have this problem with the blocking of certain users for a certain post, and then the discussion starts, and people thought that a public policy manager for Ukraine should deal with this. Katarina, the question is that, you know, in the US now there is an ongoing discussion about the legislative regulation of Facebook's activity, which deals with fake information distribution, private data, personal data distribution, and that was the initiative of both the congressman and Mark Zuckerberg himself, because he says that it's really necessary. What do you think about this path towards legislative regulation? Because when we are talking about legislative regulation, for example, the users may come to like it. How do we find this golden middle? Well, that's a very serious question. Facebook is now at the stage when we are trying to encourage the governments and regulatory bodies to join us in this process. Cambridge Analytica, which has been mentioned, is an important case, and we really consider that we didn't recognize this threat coming from this sort of company, and therefore all the time, starting with the moment when Cambridge Analytica became known and when we managed to assess the scope of the processes, it became clear that, first of all, Facebook should be changing, but the interaction of Facebook in other countries should also change. A couple of months later, after a very long process, we concluded the Memorandum of Understanding with FTC, Federal Trade Commission from the US, that is related to privacy of personal data. And that is the example of cooperation. Of course, you may say that Facebook was charged a fine, but that is the process which we welcome very much, because Facebook should not be a company which determines all the limits of the things allowed in our social media. Why FTC? Why have I mentioned this case? It is really important in the context of data privacy, because we are under reconstruction as a company and we are working with private data. And even now, when I have certain options, before I send the task to another team, I need to fill out the margins related to privacy, and every time I need to be conscious of what data should be used, what should not be used. So in fact, this is the process which started with the US and the US regulator, but that will be valid for the work of the whole company. Why do we think that over the last couple of years we have heard companies emphasizing the need for regulation? That is primarily due to the fact that Facebook realized that it is the largest platform in the world, but a great responsibility comes together with this. And we are trying to assess activity on the platform in accordance with our rules of the game in the community, which are public and which are translated into Ukrainian. And every time I'm banned on Facebook, there is no other ground for any decisions as the rules of the community, which could be controversial, which somebody may not like, but we think that it's better to stay with those rules than without them. And if you read the rules of the community, they related not only to hate speech, but they related to protection of personal data and avoidance of publication of your personal data somewhere, child pornography, illegal services like drug trafficking or human trafficking, or spread of information about publicly prohibited things, incitement to violence, video information or some information inciting you to committing suicide. These rules are really up to the point, and sometimes we may talk about their deviation from them or their implementation. But Facebook is always responsible that Facebook thinks that it should not be the only organization that decides what is right and what is wrong. On the one hand, we say that, okay, here is the government, we are ready to work with you, and we are ready to explain what the specificity of our policy is. I've come to Ukraine not just for the conference, because I've already had the meetings with the parliamentary guys, with the deputies, and definitely they have a lot of questions as to how decisions are made. We are not trying to escape from those questions. We bring our teams to Ukraine, we tell the way it works, because co-responsibility, co-regulation is a new paradigm of Facebook, which says that yes, we have common problems and there must be some global understanding as to regulation, what political advertising is, what manipulative information is, and where the limits need to be taken, how content should be regulated. Well, on the other hand, in spite of the fact that we are trying to work with the regulator, and of course not everybody is willing to do this, and therefore we're trying to be very careful about the regulators in different countries, because Facebook is a company with values, and if a certain law aims to violate fundamental democratic freedoms of citizens and our users, or interferes too much into their privacy, we will never work with this regulation. We'll try to advocate the interests of our users. And the last thing I would like to mention about responsibility of decisions is that the whole issue of regulation is derivative from who's responsible and who should be passing decisions, who should have a final say, whether their network what should be allowed, what should not. If the issue is related to content, we have started to extend an oversight board process, because as far as facilitation of the content is concerned, this is the most problematic issue for us. And there are only two types of countries. The countries which say that Facebook blocks too much information. There are countries which say that Facebook blocks too little information. So the approach is different. External oversight board's ideas is that we invite external experts who could assess the decisions of the Facebook team related to content, and we will be committed to comply with those rules. So far, we have been creating the so-called charter. And by the way, Ukrainian experts have been involved in the establishment of this external oversight board, and there will be some appointments now made, and the members of different organizations could be members.
Yeah, I'm drawing on work that I've been doing since I was at the BBC on thinking the unthinkable, or thinking the unpalatable. I'm lucky I don't work for a large organization. I now run a think tank, excuse me. But I'd like to take issue, I'm afraid, with Catherine. I think there's a danger that companies like yours and others are trying to offload responsibility for something that they could do for themselves, and do it in a very timely way before it happens. Trying to get legislation through and registration and this kind of thing is going to take a long time. But the technology and the software is moving much faster than any government systems, and certainly the United Nations and anything else. And it's down to self-regulation. But look, we report this in our book, which came out as the Cambridge Analytica scandal was unfolding. And this is not particularly about Facebook, but I give this as one example. Facebook knew that it was going to be in trouble on data, but decided probably it could wing it. It could get away with it. And as Mark Zuckerberg told the Senate on the 10th of April, we were wrong, and I'll quote to you. He said, let me just find it here. As a company, we have been, as a tech company, too focused on the positive and not nearly vigilant enough about the negative. We have been caught flat-footed. It's the same with many of the high-tech companies now. They have seen these problems coming, but thought they could get away with it in the interest of generating revenue. So it's all very well for someone like Nick Clegg, the former British Deputy Prime Minister, who's now a Vice President of Facebook for Global Affairs, going around the world saying, we want governments to regulate, but actually it can be done internally. And I think the fact is, it's becoming quite an expensive era for companies like Facebook. You've already been fined £500,000 by the British Information Commissioner. You've already been fined about $5 billion on one account. This is going to get very expensive. And I think that the regulation issue and trying to get governments to act on this, particularly when there are governments which are changing all the time in so many parts of the world, is a way of offloading when actually the work can be done internally to make sure that this is not a problem. You're smart, even algorithms can tell you when you're going to be in trouble. But that's why the Cambridge Analytica issue of 87 million packages of data being divulged, that was known about as an issue, similar to what's happened with YouTube, similar to what's happening with many of these other issues, which have created amazing friction with advertisers as well. And you know, as tech companies, that this is going to be a problem. But as those at the top believe, we don't want anything to affect our revenue until we're caught out.
Cover remark. Leo, you think that you have also a remark? Yes, you have.
I do. Sorry, Katrina, it feels like we're piling onto you. It's just, I just wanted to point out or sort of clarify the terms of the conversation we're having. So I kind of sit halfway between Katrina and Nick, which is I don't actually think it's a very wise idea for companies such as Facebook, and Facebook is not alone here, to go around self-regulating and making the rules. So I just wanted to explain why we find ourselves in this very strange position where we're talking about these things. The problem is, until about, I'd say 5 years ago, a lot of the things that we're talking about, Sonya mentioned earlier bloggers, I think. We used to talk about bloggers in the early, like around 2010 and in the first decade of the century. Bloggers we used to talk about as this exciting new thing, these people, you know, on the internet using Blogspot or WordPress and disseminating information. There was all this talk about citizen journalists. How do we sort of harness the power of these individuals who now are able to reach a wider audience? This was in the innocent days of desktop computers, before social networks really took off, and before smartphones came into the hands of half the population of the world. The problem here is not just Facebook, although Facebook is a big problem, and let's face it. The problem is all of us. The problem is professional news organizations. The problem is new news organizations. The problem fundamentally is economic incentives. When your incentive is to when the entire business of media has been turned upside down, the incentives have shifted completely. So my incentive is no longer to make you come back day to day and buy my newspaper, right? And when I say my, I don't mean The Economist, because ours still is very much that, but let's say I'm a new publication. My incentive is to build up quite a large audience so I can sell advertising against it. This has started to change over the past few years as subscription models have come in. They found it very, very difficult going. And so how do you do that? You come back to what we were talking about earlier, which is emotion. One of you mentioned storytelling and narrative. And so Facebook is the medium through which that happened for a long time. Now all of us in 2017, 2018, 2019 pile on and say Facebook needs to regulate itself. Facebook definitely needs to be regulated. The reason for that is it is a single platform with tremendous influence in every geography on this planet. However, the responsibility needs to be shared, I think, by all of us, by individuals, by media organizations, including my own, including the BBC. If you go to the BBC's website, which is great and has a lot of excellent stuff, it also has a lot of garbage. It also has a lot of clickbait. Because that is, you know, the justification I imagine at the top of broadcasting houses, that is how we bring the youth in. It's not necessarily, but I imagine that's what the justification is. So that's all, just somewhere between Facebook's, it's not really our fault, we're not a publisher, and it's all Facebook's fault, they need to sort everything out.
But Leo, can I just make it clear, I'm not talking about self-regulation, I'm talking about good practice. When Facebook has to employ 30,000 people to mediate bad content, they knew that was going to be a problem, but they didn't want to invest in 30,000 people. But when it became a public issue and advertisers started taking fright, it became an issue, and therefore they had to act.
I mean, that's also how oil companies and tobacco companies work, right? The nature of big companies is to avoid this until they're forced to do it.
I knew that if there will be a Facebook person on the panel, definitely it will raise many questions. Before joining Facebook, I was actually working also in the journalism case, like civic journalism, public diplomacy, and misinformation. So I was an expert on manipulative news and fake news. And obviously, I was very much desperate about the things that I thought could be done or should be done by the platform. But when I joined the company and I started to know more how we're operating, and I started receiving questions and requests, first of all, from Ukraine, but also from other countries, because I manage 5 countries, but Ukraine is my core one. Quite often, they expect or ask things that Facebook, in their opinion, should do, which in my opinion go too far. we as a global platform shouldn't have the type of power or responsibility to decide upon everything. Sometimes, for example, I'm receiving a request that take down some content because it's illegal. Facebook can't decide whether content is legal or not. In every single country, there is different legal system. This is the principle that I'm talking about, that it is about the discussion, it's about the conversation, who holds the responsibility. And I think it is incredibly dangerous if an authoritarian or totalitarian regime states decide about everything which is shared in media and obviously has a say on the free speech, but is exactly as dangerous and possibly unsettling and accountable for every one of us, because I can be a Facebook employee, but also I'm a human being, I'm also a consumer of the news, and obviously I'm using the platform. We also shouldn't have that much responsibility, and this is Facebook. What is Facebook saying? We found ourselves in the position when we were developing as a tech platform, and currently we have to have a say in every single issue. And that is why we are ready to engage. Obviously, I do agree with you, there are many things that should be changed by Facebook. There are things that we are trying to do, some of them successful, some aren't. But I'm talking about finding a common stance and having a common discussion, what should be done better or what shouldn't be done by Facebook or by others.
Я хотела бы добавить в эту дискуссию.
I would also like to add into this discussion the statement that really you are the key issue. The key issue of this discussion is about who shall be responsible about what is happening in Facebook. And it seems to me that until Facebook says that, okay, we cannot be responsible ourselves, we should share this responsibility with somebody else and discuss it with somebody else, that's the way it's going to happen. But let's take a different problem which used to be topical, that is the problem of intellectual right protection online. YouTube undertook the responsibility and they said that, okay, we will protect intellectual property rights. They have machine learning and algorithms, and using these notions they created a perfect content ID system which is developing. They found a way out, they found some legal issues, how they could cooperate with the whole world in this issue. Well, yes, that is a complex issue, a tough one, but I'm personally convinced that everything depends on their willingness of people to solve the issue and on whether the platform is responsible for the content and whether it accepts this responsibility. And also about how to find a solution. What solution could be found? Well, that's a different pair of shoes. And it seems to me that while Facebook does not recognize responsibility for the dissemination of its content on the platform, the discussion will keep going. Well, could I tell a couple of words as to what we are doing in different fields? And let's get back probably to the issue of interaction between professional media organizations, Facebook and social media. I would like to probably ask Sonya the question, what could this partnership be like between social media and professional media organizations for us to really reduce the amount of information which is unverified, which is fake information? And could we, and how, if yes, find a background for this sort of cooperation? Well, it's a multi-tier question. It's difficult to give an ambiguous answer within 1 or 2 minutes. But first of all, and this is the most important thing, is self-regulation of mass media. Self-regulation of mass media is closely connected to advertisements, and we know this. And if mass media is really economically independent, sustainable, not subordinated to anybody, then of course high quality content generated by them will be supported by other mass media or by social media. But if we speak about Ukraine's reality, we may well be faced with the situation that every individual may set up something called mass media, but in fact this is going to be nothing more than tabloids. And we have a lot of such editions, and difficult to control their number, right? When a sudden conflict situation starts and somebody has a war on somebody, and well, millions of examples like this, somebody writes that, for example, he is eating small babies in the morning, and that is in large font on the front page with pictures, with crucified boy. Will Facebook catch it? Will it provide this information? Yes, but the original source is this tabloid press. And together with the lawyers, we're trying to get clear about this situation and as a minimum to go to court. And then it appears that this cannot be done because there is a virtual platform which is not registered anywhere. All the more the onus is staying in Poland, and all the money transfer for these materials are going to this card account. What do we do? Well, we have so many stories like this. I don't want to mention any specific edition I'm not talking about, but sometimes it's even considered to be respected, but I've seen some other publications, unverified publications by them, and it's a tough situation because sometimes I need to convince adults not to read headlines like shock. It has been a shock for Ukraine. If you see a kind of a headline like this, this is not news, this is not verified information, but people somehow consume this content. Here we should also talk about the responsibility of media platforms and social media, but you also have your own critical thinking. You either trust or you don't. Either you trust this source of information or you don't. And if you don't understand who the source was and what the source is and how information was disseminated, but you disseminate it further on, well, I think it's a question more to this in the video.
We're in danger of being too idealistic here. There are 150 of us sitting here on a Saturday morning. I think the profoundly sinister development that's happening is there are a large number of people out there who don't care about whether a fact is correct or not. They want to hear what they want to hear, and I think that's what you've seen with Trump in the United States, and I fear that's maybe what you're going to see in the British election. You're seeing it in Hungary, you're seeing it in Poland. There are large numbers of people out there, and I think it's around 40%. The polls in the United States are consistent in their support for Trump, regardless of whether he talks rubbish or not, or he puts out false facts. There's a different environment in which we're all working. We as journalists want to make sure that the facts are correct, but I am no longer convinced that the public really is concerned about whether something is correct or not. They seem to be more concerned that they hear what they want to hear. I'm going to give you a little story. In the Scottish referendum 3 years ago, when Scotland voted not to leave the United Kingdom, a good friend of mine who used to work in public diplomacy in NATO, he was going through Scotland in Edinburgh, and he met a very broad Scotsman wearing a kilt, looking like he'd been on a battlefield. And he had a big T-shirt on saying, "We was robbed." I'm sorry, my Scottish is not very good. "We was robbed." And Ben went up to him and said, "What do you mean we was robbed?" "Aye, we was robbed. The English stole the referendum." And Ben, who's working for NATO at the time, said, "What do you mean the English stole the referendum? How do you know that?" He said, "I know everything." And this is in Scotland. "I know everything. I watch Russia Today every night." Now, I work for a news organization which is regulated by Ofcom, but the voice that comes from Moscow is not regulated by Ofcom. And the Chinese are very strong in this market now. CCTV is becoming very, very prevalent, and I could tell you much more about that. So we are facing essentially a war on accuracy and truth, because the public is not necessarily that convinced anymore.
So?
I want to come back to the social networks, and maybe to broadcast again later, but just back to the social networks, a couple of phrases that I've heard have worried me. One was much earlier, one of you said something about controlling information, and then I think, Sevil, you just said something about reducing information. And these, I think, are not terms that journalists, certainly, but anybody who believes in liberalism or democracy should be using. There's a lot of bad, malicious, inaccurate information, but controlling information is something authoritarian regimes do, not liberal ones. So then, okay, fine, that's easy enough to say, right? It's a nice ideology, but there's still lots of toxic stuff out there. How do we deal with it? So one answer that I used to give myself was that blame the algorithms, blame Facebook's algorithm because it prioritizes emotional content, stuff that annoys you, get some sort of reaction because that'll make you read it, that'll make you share it. It's good for engagement, it's good for the business of whatever publication is putting it out, it's good for Facebook's business. This was an easy answer and I liked giving it myself. Turns out, while that is a problem, and Facebook has actually changed that for its own reasons, turns out that wasn't actually the problem. The problem is human beings are the problem. We're the problem. So how do we know that? I'm from India. I've lived in the UK for 10 years, but I'm from India. I pay a lot of attention to what happens in India. And in India, anybody with a smartphone uses WhatsApp. Also owned by Facebook, but that's besides the point. WhatsApp has no algorithms, right? WhatsApp is a messaging service. I use it to text my parents back in India. I am in groups like all of you must be. And what happened with WhatsApp? People, individuals, no algorithms, are spreading lies, falsehoods. And as a result, at least in India, and this has happened in other places, people have been lynched. The big thing in India is there's child abductors in our village. Then some stranger comes into your village and you murder him. That's it, finished. Can't blame algorithms. So what do? We don't want to reduce or control information because that is a very dangerous path to go down. We can't just blame the algorithms because even when you take away the algorithms, human beings behave badly and spread lies and malicious information. The answer, I think, and The Economist thinks, we've written about this, is slow down the information. It's a structural change, not a tactical one. Not less information, just less quickly. Force people to think about what they're reading, force people to think about what they're sharing. So WhatsApp did this about a year ago and has seen some success. So instead of being able to share, forward a post to all of your friends, to all of the groups, they said, you can only share to 5 people at a time. If you want to share more, go back to it again. The whole process takes 5 seconds. It's not a big deal. But these little speed bumps, and other social networks have started introducing stuff like this. I mean, much less. Instagram is going to, as of this week, next week, stop showing likes. So that's a good thing. It lowers the incentives. It already doesn't allow sharing, but there's ways around it. So slowing down the information, I think, is one way to deal with the issues that we've been talking about today.
Thank you, Leo. Давайте поговоримо про результати.
Let's talk about the results of our survey of the audience. So we have asked our audience who will win in the fight for the trust of the audience. And that has been a rather controversial discussion as to who still is responsible for the content shared, what should be done with Facebook, what should be done with media, hygiene, and so on and so forth. And 51% has participated in the voting, and 45% of our respondents have answered that social media will win in the fight for the trust of the audience, which is a rather interesting figure. But I see some hope in the second answer, that 37% claim that they need to be united in this fight, and I really think so. I think that the future of professional journalism and information hygiene really depends on how social media and professional media will manage to regulate this issue together and how they will manage to interact. And I think that in the future, that will be the case, because we know that, for example, Google is now actively financing and joining in the process of funding local media in the US, and that Facebook has supported this initiative. So I think that in the future, in some 2 or 3 years, we will see these partnership projects between different global platforms and professional media on different levels. We are soon going over to the Q&A session, and at the end, I would still ask each of you to give 2 pieces of recommendation, maybe 1 or 2 pieces of recommendation to people who consume information, who devour the information, who are staying in the audience, as to how they could protect it, get protected, how they could consume information and verify this information in the era of media disruption and post-truth. So some of your professional recommendations will takes away for the people to take them into account. So Katja, we'll start with you. Well, thank you for starting with me, but I think that the most important idea which has not been voiced today as yet is that really they need to get united. So what is being done already in this direction? And if we speak about Facebook, I will probably take some more time to cover this issue, because without this information, the context of our conversation would be a little bit wrong, because we are not talking about what is happening, but we are talking about what should be the case. The situation is going to be changing, in particular due to my appearance in the company. We have two things of principle. First of all, Facebook works with the news organizations for them to be able to capitalize, to monetize, and to develop, and for high-quality journalism to exist. Because yes, of course, we have a great difference between standards of BBC, let's say, and the standards of, I will not mention any tabloid press, which have been mentioned by Sonya. We all know what these newspapers are. And the other component is working with the audience, with the users, which first of all stands for media literacy, but at the same time it stands for the cleaning of the information environment. This information has probably been already voiced today, but this is the thing we're going to launch in Ukraine in 2020. We will disseminate for Ukraine the best practice of Facebook, which is already used in other countries, third-party checker. We will cooperate with local fact-checkers, with local organizations that will assess the content available in the network and spread on Facebook by different scales. And we will not just tell that this is true or not true, but we will try to use some algorithms for checking information. As far as media campaigns are concerned, in Ukraine in summer we had one with wide coverage, and it was, I would say, the most large-scale media campaign in Ukraine, and we had 4 partners: Detective Media, Ox Ukraine, Subfake, Internews Ukraine. These are the things that we will keep on implementing, because people need to be aware, they need to be informed. Yeah, the last remarks. So getting back to your question about the pieces of recommendations, I would say that first of all, critically important is critical thinking, and I'm not saying this as an employee of Facebook, but as a person who's been analyzing security, information security for a couple of years, because not a single organism, government, state or law can protect you fully from poor quality information or potentially dangerous information. And this front line of fighting with poor quality and dangerous information is you. If a person really doesn't ask critical questions and does not make any critical analysis, it would be very difficult to prevent this. But the other thing is that you need to support high-quality media. That is a trend developing in the world now, and I'm sure that we will also have it in Ukraine. High-quality things are really worth being paid for. So I think that this is the future of our journalism. Thank you. I've understood that I need to be brief now. So everything is that simple. First of all, you don't need to trust the headlines. You need to go into the depths, and preferably by the end. And secondly, you should not trust only one source of information. You should always take into account several sources, and you can always find what is in common and what is different there. And the third thing is that in any way, every media brand has some reputation, some image, and I really think that we need to choose the ones with good reputation, and we should trust these ones. Sonya? Well, I will just sum up what I've already mentioned a couple of times. Trust only the sources of information you're 100% sure of, because that is a special individual, a live individual. There are some sources, some reputation, media image behind him, some professionalism, professional field of activity. Yes, but everybody can be mistaken. Well, sure, professional journalists can also be mistaken, but I have a question to the person who, being like a politician, starts commenting everything, starting with industry and up to rocket building. Is he really competent in everything? So I don't think so. And there are a lot of such people in the broadcast of our TV channels. That's why it's important. And critical thinking has also been mentioned. I think it's important. Leo?
I feel like everybody who's in this room and has come to this discussion already knows that they need to think critically about what they read, that they need to have several sources, all of that. So I won't condescend to you by telling you to do that. What I will suggest is that you subscribe to The Economist and help pay my wages.
Я, до речі, підписана на The Economist, тому Нік.
By the way, I'm a subscriber of The Economist, so.
Is The Economist that worried that you need to appeal for people to subscribe to The Economist at the moment?
See, unlike the BBC, we can't force the entire country to pay us.
I'm a subscriber to The Economist. It's great. You can pick it up on your iPad anywhere in the world
English
as well.
humor.
I would subscribe to everything that's been said, particularly about critical analysis and critical thinking from Katarzyna to Anne to everyone on the panel. But there is still this real weakness that there are vast numbers of people out there, and many of you have been using this throughout this discussion as I have, who believe that if it's on a screen, it's correct. It's about analyzing, it's about questioning, it's about essentially being like a journalist. Is that really true? Should we be finding out much more? Do you believe President Trump when he says the American economy is in great shape? Well, you've got to start looking at the fundamentals. So it is about asking questions and using those powers of analysis. But I'd like to pick up one point, if I can, on the discussion I've been having with Katarzyna during this debate. I'd like you to take a message back to One Hacker Way in Menlo Park, if I may. It's all very well saying, well, it's evolving internally and so on. I just point you to Dieselgate for VW. They tried to ride the belief that they could get away with faking emissions, particularly in California, and look at the price that they're paying financially anyway, with a large number of senior executives who've had to leave. They knew what was going to happen, but they thought they could get away with it. And the same with the Boeing 737 MAX. They tried to get a system through, which has now led to 350 people being killed. And there's doubts about the regulatory process with the FAA as to what corners were cut. And look at the damage that there is for the brand of Boeing. It may be an existential financial crisis. They're producing 42 MAX 737s each month, but all of them are not being sold. I put that to you because I would suggest that there could be, if there's a regulatory pushback here, a dramatic set of fines. In the European Union, if you cross the line of acceptable behavior, you are fined 4% of your turnover. Well, even for Facebook, that's a lot of money. British Airways have just been fined £193 million for a failure of their computer system. They knew there was a problem, but they thought they could get away with it. So 4% of your turnover every time you are fined, that becomes a massive negative on your cash flow. And in the cash-strapped journalistic business, that can destroy you in a matter of days.
Дякую всім учасникам нашої дискусії. Є у нас
Well, thanks to all the participants. We have just 5 minutes for questions and answers, so we may have 2. Good morning. The question is to Lear, so I'll ask it in English.
About first, big fan. Secondly, in this discussion about transformation of media, I feel that the company that hasn't been mentioned is ByteDance, the holding company of TikTok. I work at Accenture Interactive, but here I'm in the capacity of a TikTok influencer. So a question is, now that the Chinese company is penetrating the hearts and minds of Western teenagers, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities for the media environment? And also, I guess, a question to Kate about how Facebook is dealing with the TikTok rise to fame. Thank you.
That's a great question. I'm really pleased you asked that. TikTok's great. I love it. I don't go on it too often because I emerge only 45 minutes later in a daze, and it's a massive time suck. But the thing I think, the sort of profound effect that TikTok is having and will have on Western discourse is, and American discourse in particular, is for the first time, and I'm not the only person to note this, for the first time, Americans are understanding what it means for their media systems and their citizens to be using a platform that they do not control. We've all done that for the past decade and a half. All of us in Ukraine, in Britain, in India, have been using systems that are created by people who think in a particular way from one corner of one continent with a certain history of its own, right? My way of looking at the world, having grown up in India, is different from Nick's, having lived in Britain, and from yours. So I think that is, so recognizing that as American lawmakers and regulators are having to start to do, and then looking back at themselves, ideally, is what will happen, maybe not. And the important thing about TikTok, I think, is to not get distracted by questions of censorship of Hong Kong protests or Tiananmen Square or whatever. I think the question is much more fundamental, is what happens when your media systems are not in your control? And I'm hopeful that this will lead to some reflection on the part of American lawmakers and regulators, and will reflect on the YouTubes and Facebooks of this world.
Thank you. And second question.
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Bitsurkiw. I'm a global affairs analyst, and I contribute frequently to an outlet that Donald Trump just referred to again yesterday as fake news, CNN Opinion. A very quick question. So I just finished covering the Canadian election, and it was a unique election in the sense that we had many young candidates. What was interesting there is all of them, the young people running, had a digital footprint that went all the way back to the day they were born. And a lot of that content was used by politicians to trash them, and some candidates had to resign. Now, we're now all looking at the next US election, and chances are Trump will use the same playbook, fill the airwaves, social media with a lot of lies and half-truths without, excuse me, without any consequences to his base, to his support. I'm wondering, maybe to Katya and anyone else who wants to answer, what kind of solutions are there to better prepare people against that flood of lies and half-truths? Can technology do it, human beings, or do journalists have to do a better job in terms of countering those? Thank you.
І ось тут теж хочуть поставити питання, Михайло.
And here is also a question, and then we will try to answer these two questions. I just wanted to say that the notion of fake news consists of two parts. There is fake and there is news. And normally we say that lack of truth may appear anywhere, while the news should come from journalists. And my impression is that the level of journalism now is in the situation where it's very difficult to differentiate between fake and news. So my question is, what should we do for the level of journalism in Ukraine to become high, and should the state be involved in supporting this transition to better journalism? So, Sonya, yeah, I'll be in brief, because this topic is a pain in the neck for me as for the practicing lecturer. The state definitely should not support us, because when the state starts interfering, nothing good comes of that. All the more, the previous experience has shown that almost all the authorities on coming to power start with the attempt to regulate the situation with the mass media. And then they quit this idea, they give it up. Yeah, I hope that this time this will also give it up, because it would be rather good. And they are trying to create some commissions to protect journalists against something, so it's very bad. I think that we should have a self-regulated process with fair competition, which is a precondition for the development of mass media. And when I'm talking about the market, I mean general economic situation where all the components are interrelated. This is thing number one. And the second thing is definitely education. But I've been listening to what my colleagues said, and you know, journalism is an applied thing, and it's impossible to learn it only within the audience. You need to learn it both in the editorial board and with your audience. And this is a profession you need to love. You need to be willing to achieve some excellence in this field. You want to be both smart and clever and talk to the microphones in front of the camera, and you think that you should just be watched on YouTube because you are nice, you are beautiful. So this is rather arguable, I would say. I really trust in ecosystems. It seems to me that for something to work, everybody needs to participate. All the stakeholders need to participate. These are universities, the state, and the company. So, to put it in specific terms, when our educational facilities really perceive their students as a product which will be in demand in the market, that would be good. And if they're funding, their ratings will really depend on the quality of the product. Well, then everything will be okay, and then we'll start making journalists not within 5 years, but within 1 year. We will always have good journalists, and then companies will create opportunities for the internship of these journalists, and they will install proper standards, and then it will work. And then the state will at least not prevent all this from happening, because we are already accustomed to the situation when they prevent, they just interfere. So when this ecosystem works, that will all work. So far we don't have this in place. I'm in favor of practice, and media campaigns need to create some opportunities for people to come there, to learn, to develop. The other thing is that there is a great problem now, because the very notion of journalism is being transformed, and these are not just the standards we are discussing, but this is also what the journalist is, what a multi-platform journalist is. He should not just write, but he should be the operator at the same time, camera operator. And finally, that will all depend on the demand on behalf of companies and business for such people. And these companies can actually try and train these people.
On your point, I can't comment particularly on the United States, but I think you raise a very, very critical issue, not just in the United States. I'm going back to what I said 15 minutes ago. I think these are potentially very sinister and deeply worrying times. I think CNN is doing a great job, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post. And if you know that Trump has ordered that the Washington Post and New York Times subscription should be abolished in every government department. So we can see the direction it's going, but I come back to that polling from Pew and everything else, showing that here, it doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. People are being told what they want to hear. And I fear that's what's happening in the United Kingdom during this current debate for the election. And I go back to that faked advertising example where the Conservative Party actually actively edited the wrong answer onto a question on a breakfast television show to show the spokesperson for against Brexit in the Labour Party to be dithering and not answering, but that was edited on. Will that actually affect people, or will people just see it and say, well, that's what we assumed anyway, so why bother about it? Similarly, in the United Kingdom, Brexit was voted for by a majority of 52% to 48%, partly on a commitment to get £350 million back and spent on the NHS, the National Health Service, every week. That was unachievable, but people believed it. So I fear we're into a whole different era of who believes what. And therefore your question is good, but the answer I think is bleak.
And I can pick up the question, which Michael, very happy to see you again, obviously, that you asked me about what are the efforts of the platform to combat, to get ready to the US 2020 election, which is incredibly important task for us. And three main areas. So first, fighting the CAB, so coordinating inauthentic behavior, and foreign influence. We have been taking down the networks of coordinating behavior, popularly known in Ukraine as bot farms and troll farms. We're using different terms. Almost every single week. And we are proactively doing this in every single country we have elections. Once again, since we're in Ukraine, I will give you Ukrainian context. We have been proactively shutting down CAB networks before the presidential elections, before the parliamentary elections, and then in September we had a unique case when we shut down the huge troll farm, which was specifying in the making money out of political campaigns and dirty PR. We increase in transparency, meaning that there will be a label in state-owned media, so our users would know that these channels or these pages are pushing the narrative not only of the owner or the editorial policy, but also of the state. There will be more transparency about the pages and also about the political ads, because we're introducing the spending tracker, so everyone would see not only the publicly available information in the ads libraries, who is standing behind the campaign, but also it will be easy to calculate how much money is spent. And obviously the biggest and the most challenging part is fighting misinformation. We're introducing new waves of labeling misinformation which has been fact-checked, so it will be more visually, I mean, it will be visually easier to detect whether it's a misinformation. We will be blurring the messaging of the links. We're also thinking about introducing so-called perpetuative violators and some like websites which are constantly sharing fake news. They won't be welcome on the platform. And obviously we're investing great amount of money in education. So voter suppression, reducing information which is wrong about what elections is about, but also educating people what is news, what is happening with the presidential campaign, what are the candidates, and obviously critical thinking and media literacy. So those are three main areas that we will be working on.
Дякую дуже. Ми змушені завершувати.
Well, thanks a lot. We need to finish because we are already 7 minutes late. Thanks a lot to our participants. Definitely we will not have a chance to answer all the questions and to find solutions to all the problems, because these are global problems and they are being looked for everywhere in the world. But at least we made an attempt, and we have come to the conclusion that everything depends on education, on critical thinking, based on this education, and on partnership between social media and professional media, and also business. And I hope that in the future we will manage to speak a lot more in specific detail about what sort of partnership we could have and whether it could be based on the regulated on the legislative basis. Thanks to all the speakers. I hope it was of interest.